of the American concept of what it means to be an educated person. Most states have dropped foreign language requirements. So I would, she also characterized, we are a know as little as you can get away with nation. So I would count this as, pessimistic, camp, someone in the pessimistic, camp. So what about the second panelist? This is a specialist associated with the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C. She says that I believe the main reason for this disparity, so U.S., in terms of foreign language capacity, this foreign languages are treated by our public education system as less important than math, science, and so on and so forth. So many U.S. school programs offer general exposure to languages, but don't expect proficiency. So again, I would count this as pessimistic. So what about the third panelist? This is a pair of specialists associated with Princeton University, the Institute for Advanced Study. What they say here, let's say, it's the new interest in learning Chinese, another language fact. We certainly hope not, but the U.S. record with foreign language instruction is underwhelming. Again, this is pessimistic. And now this one is UC Davis computer science professor. He designed, I think, language learning software too, encouraging people, of course, to learn Chinese. What he says is that it's only natural that with Chinese rise of China, the importance of China, dealing with China, learning the language is going to be a necessity. So he's kind of optimistic. So 3 to 1, 3 pessimistic and 1 optimistic. Another fellow panelist, he's a professor of education at UC Berkeley. And what he says is that, so we'd better get to know them, meaning China and Chinese. So it's kind of, out of necessity. So it's kind of optimistic. So 3 to 2. And finally, this guy looks familiar. I was asked to provide a linguistic, kind of perspective. What do you think, in terms of the difficulty of language, Chinese as a language, similar to what Professor Huang probably, just talked about. In terms of the language, do you think this is something, can be a major optical thing for, American English speakers to do? I think what I said there was, overall, I'm kind of conditionally, optimistic without, saying any, committed stance. But I think that's true. I still believe this is the case. As long as China is on the rise, we can expect that interest in the Chinese language will grow. The rest of my contribution was devoted to saying why, you shouldn't fear the Chinese language, because Chinese language is not necessarily the worst language, most difficult as many people perceive to be, because, there are many ways Chinese is very easy, other ways Chinese, is difficult. So that's my, overall stance. I still believe that's the case. So just if you look at the survey, it's overall, it's not very, optimistic, I would say. But, a lot of things, I would think, it's related to language and non-language related stuff. So to me, to summarize what I would like to offer here, my perspective is that globalizing a language such as Mandarin Chinese is a long process. It's never easy. It's not that, we can think of all the possibilities, but whatever possibility there is, the process has to be very long. Chinese language itself, from a linguistic point of view, is has disadvantages and also advantages in, at least for American English speakers. If you look at the language carefully, which we don't have time to talk about here, I think results or future of Mandarin Chinese as a world language depend heavily on, probably sometimes on non-linguistic factors. So where will we be, as in terms of thinking of Chinese as a real global world language? It really depends on many factors that probably very often beyond our control, but that doesn't mean we as language professionals cannot contribute. I think we can contribute, but the factors are really complex. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor Tao. May I now call upon Professor Paul Thompson to make a few observations based on the very complex and variegated topics that he has heard. Thank you.
I stand here as someone who is not an expert in this area at all, but someone who found the preceding 3 talks absolutely fascinating, very provocative. There's plenty for people to talk about. I'm not sure that I'm particularly the best person to be posing a lot of questions, but I hope I can at least get the ball rolling by posing 1 or 2. Sort of looking back on what's been said so far, we heard first from Professor Kirkpatrick, who raised some concerns about the effects that global languages, looking both at English and at Chinese, the effects that these may have regionally on Asian languages. The growth of English and Chinese as major languages can have a deleterious effect upon other languages, which is something that we may need to bear in mind. We also looked at issues of the creativity of the hybrid languages. And this was picked up, this was talked about both by Professor Kirkpatrick and by Professor Huang, with lots of very interesting examples. I mean, obviously, hybridity is very creative between all sorts of languages, but particularly, I think, in Asia, I get the sense that the hybridity of Chinese and English amongst bilinguals, etc., can lead to tremendous growth of new ways of expressing ideas. One thing that I wondered, I mean, in the key theme of bending but not breaking, I can see the Chinese orthography absorbing Roman alphabet can lead to a lot of very interesting play, but at the same time, perhaps it may make Chinese language a little sort of disparate, breaking up in different areas, as some Chinese speakers in some areas may gradually absorb more and more new forms into Chinese, and that wonderfully robust system of Chinese characters, which, as we've heard, has persisted over very, very long periods of history. This interplay with the Roman alphabet may lead to a gradual breaking up of that robustness, perhaps. So that's one question I wanted to put across, was to what extent this hybridity is actually leading to a kind of breakup of the strength of Chinese. We also heard about we heard a number of cautions. We heard Donald Trump saying China many times. I can't help wondering what he was saying about China around each time he mentioned China. And the questions about the number of people learning Chinese in the United States, I'm afraid I don't have any information about the take-up of people learning Chinese in different parts of the world. I was interested to hear from one of the delegates at this conference that in Kenya, at least, there are very large numbers of Kenyans wanting to learn Chinese now. A lot of this, as Professor Kirkpatrick mentioned, relate to the importance of being able to speak Chinese in order to communicate with Chinese tourists and Chinese businessmen and Chinese workers who are moving around the globe, and therefore people realize the need to be able to communicate with them. But these may be primarily transactional interactions rather than particularly cultural interactions it may be more purpose-driven. And another question that was raised was that around identity, so that where English can be a way of reflecting cultural experience of its speakers, as yet this may not be the case for Chinese. Learning Chinese, as Professor Kirkpatrick mentioned, is to want to have a Chinese-centric experience. It may not be a way of expressing one's own non-Chinese experience, whereas English does have the potential, or has been realized as a way of expressing something which may not be possible. An example of that is in South Africa during the struggle against apartheid, that English had a rather peculiar status, as it was the language that could be used between South African groups for whom they didn't share the same language, but it was a way of expressing an independence, a resistance to the Afrikaans of the ruling party. And so it perhaps has a more developed status as a lingua franca that can be used for a variety of purposes, not just for communicating between different groups, but also for expressing identity. And I think Professor Tao was very realistic when he talked about the emergence of Chinese as a global language as a long process, which will take a long time. There's perhaps a lot of excitement at the moment about the spread of Chinese or Chineses, but I think it's quite right to suggest that this will take a long time to really spread and become established. So those are observations, a sort of summary of some of the things that we've heard. I would like to invite a little bit of reflection now upon the notion that hybridity, or Chinese, the hybridity of Chinese and Englishes may actually be leading to a gradual breakup of Chinese. And I'd like to just put that idea across and invite Professor Huang to respond to that, if I may.
Thank you, Professor Thompson. At this point, perhaps may I invite the speakers to come and sit on the bench or on the table, sorry. Sorry. We still have about 20 minutes for Q&A. And since a question has already been raised, maybe as we take our seats, perhaps Professor Wang can then address that question. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah, please. Right.
Okay, let me start because I think there must be another question from the from the audience to want to talk to other panelists. I think for the issue that's been just raised, and for Chinese as a global language, world Chinese, it's very important to know that actually there's a dichotomy of Chinese that is unusual. It's not unlike English because the writing system, right? Because that's why this issue of break coming out from Professor Thompson. Think about it. The writing system of Chinese, right? In a sense, it's already a global language because the kanji system and of writing system actually is adopted by Japanese and by Korean for a long time, therefore, even though, before the Hangul comes in. And then there is the issue, actually. This will go back to the issue of Professor Kirkpatrick's point of view. That is, I agree with your point, but if you're only talking about the writing system, actually, there is no problem of acculturation. Actually, Japanese identify kanji as their culture. And they use, as I give you an example already, they use the Chinese system to represent the kind of the conceptual system they have in their language. So in the writing system side, actually, Chinese system, the writing system does allow acculturation, that allow different cultures to claim its own. It's different from English to say that you actually, it's deculturalization. Actually, it allows multiple cultures to claim it as its own, right? But that process obviously takes much longer, and then it only has happened more successfully in Japanese, Korean, and to some extent Vietnamese for some time. Yeah. So that's the side of it. One thing I want to emphasize, so now that we put it apart on the spoken part of it, right? And what would it break the robustness of the Chinese language system? So that's why I want to emphasize, number one, it is really not influenced by English. It really is just following 26 more symbols in a way that Chinese decide how to use it. And so it actually doesn't create a gap. It's not the haves. The alphabetical word doesn't belong to those who knows English. Anyone in China now use them, right? Whether they can write it, very fluently or not, but it obviously it's the word. These are the words PK, AIDS. So these are the words that everyone uses, right? Whether they know Chinese or English or not. But of course, that is prescribing that actually most of the Chinese students went through at least middle school. They learned the alphabet through learning English. But these are the people who knows the language, but they know how to use it. And so there is a dichotomy, hybridity, there's a dichotomy there. What I observe already is that they follow the Chinese morphological rule, A, Z, A, Ka, B, Ka. So on that part, you see that they don't break. On the other hand, there is some break in the sense of the phonological system somehow is skewed. But somehow, so far, what we see here is that these possible break is being compartmentalized by limiting these new words to use only the alphabets. And that is being managed right now. Right? So I don't have a question, I don't have an answer for you, whether it will break the robust system. I can only say that so far, the status quo of compartmentalizing and following still the Chinese semantic-based morphological system seem to have maintained the status quo without creating a have and have-nots. Introducing this new system without privileging only the people who know English. And that's within China. But how would that affect the global Chinese is a question actually I would like to see to find out in the future too. Thank you.
Right. So I'd like to call upon questions from the audience. Yes, please. Yes. Followed by that gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. I'd like to share some of the things I observe in the UK. Perhaps not the best person to share this. I used to study in the University of Warwick, and one of the tutors there was doing some research in the teaching Chinese, Mandarin Chinese in the UK, in England, and Scotland. Well, there are three things I observe quite different from the US. One thing is, one of her research is she went to different training schools and language centers across England and found many Hong Kongese immigrant family. They now want their children to study Mandarin Chinese, and also they send their children to the after-class training center. And she and her student went to many schools in Midland area and found the result. And the other two phenomena I observe is the school. There was a school in Bohong, I think it's in Hampshire, in England. They adopted a very different curriculum, teaching Chinese using Chinese to teach mathematics. And the school is called the Bohong School. And I was very lucky to know one of the teachers there, Li Ching Wei, and she used Mandarin Chinese to teach different courses. And at the very beginning of this year, the BBC, they made a very special document in that school. Is the Chinese, the students use a Chinese education system to have a trial, have a pilot, something like that. It's in Bohong School. And the other is, I don't think I can remember the exact date of the GCSE reform, GCSE policy in England, but I think since the approximately September of 2014, many secondary schools in England started Mandarin Chinese as one of the course and options for teaching a modern foreign language. This is what I observe in England and Scotland. Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Thierry. That gentleman there, please.
Yes, I'd start without the microphone. I think I'm audible enough here. My question is, hasn't the system already been broken through the introduction of a simplified writing system and pinyin as an input method? Because it's no longer used as a system for transliteration, pinyin, but actually actively taught and used by Chinese students, at least in the mainland. And in contrast to that, I mean, if you look at keyboards in Hong Kong, you still have strokes on them. You use the strokes, so you have that basis. And also, if you think about the fact of simplification, what it entails, I frequently hear from mainland Chinese students that they don't have too much of a problem actually reading traditional characters. Whereas the other way round, I keep on hearing, and I don't know whether everybody else would subscribe to that, is very, very difficult sometimes to really understand the simplified characters without having learned them maybe. So maybe that's already a kind of break in the system, I find, because you lose something. It's a bit similar to the introduction of Hangul, as you said, which was basically introduced by Sejong to allow its people to develop in a different way and to reach independence. So I don't know what you think about that. Whether you might get this possibly your best
Let me address that issue. I have already mentioned that actually when I talked about the homomorphism in the writing system, I have actually including the simplified system in it. Of course, I mean, you don't have 100% preservation. So that itself is not a break of system itself. The systematic correlation are still there, except for a few examples. I mean, the famous example like year of the leaves. Leaves should have grass radical becomes mouse radical, and that breaks the system. But those are exceptional examples. But you will notice that actually in the language reform system, pinyin failed. The Chinese government had to retract because originally the idea was to go all the way to pinyin, and that didn't work. And exactly because that will break the system. If pinyin is really successful being used as the common writing system, then that robustness of the Chinese writing is broken. So there's a very strong resistance, and it didn't work. So that's exactly why the robustness of the system is preserved. So.
But that is assuming that things only work if you go 100% rather than halfway. But are we already halfway at least?
Well, I would argue that the system isn't broken. It's just a question of language reform and language change that is just a natural historical development. But I just have something here which is quite amusing, I think, informative. When someone really did try to break the system, and this is Qian Xuantung, who worked at the University of Beijing University, the Peking University in the turn of the century. He writes to Chundu Xu, who was one of the founder members of the Communist Party, and he writes this, and this was a real attempt to break the system. In an earlier essay of yours, you strongly advocated the abolition of Confucianism. Now I think that's the only way to save China, but you must go further. If you want to abolish Confucianism, you must first abolish the Chinese language, right? That's one Chinese scholar. Now, that didn't happen. What did happen was a language reform. There was a move from Wunyan, the classical language, to Baihua, the vernacular variety. There was simplification of characters. There was the introduction of pinyin, eventually to help primary kids learn rather than to replace characters. So I don't think it's broken at all. I also think those simplified characters, although they were formalized, a lot of them have been in constant use over many, many decades beforehand. So they're not as if they were new. So I don't think it's a broken system. I think it's a very robust system. But I think it's a lot of opportunity for creativity and development with it.
And I'd just like to add very quickly that Pinyin actually is functioning today as an excellent auxiliary system. Because, well, in fact, the speakers have mentioned, in the realm of education, it facilitates the learning of Chinese characters. In fact, Pinyin is instructed first before Chinese children get exposed to huge numbers of characters around them, right? So the next question, please. Yes, please, and then that lady.
Andy earlier mentioned the differences between World Englishes and World Chineses, maybe because the World Englishes, they have the non-native speakers forming their own varieties, but in Chinese sense, most of them are the native Chinese speakers, like Singapore, China, Taiwan. But I noticed something happening in Guangzhou. If you go to Guangzhou, you see thousands of African people now living in Guangzhou. Many, many. So a lot from Nigeria, Mali, and many African countries. Actually, I found some statistics. Okay, there are 16,000 residents, African residents living in Guangzhou now. And actually, in 2014, 430,000 Africans entered and exit Guangzhou in the first 9 months of 2014. That's a huge amount of African people going to China. And many of them, they don't share the same language.